The purpose of endurance training is to develop specific metabolic systems of the body, energetic systems of the body. And how do you do that? Well, you are doing it by implementing training zones. Training zones is a concept that you use that you can actually target specific energetic systems of the body and improve them according to your needs. So your needs can vary. You have professional athletes, they have different needs. You have clinical patient population, they have different needs. You have amateurs, or now we can see that fitness is in expansion and everybody wants to do sport, but they're not doing it to have high performance. They're doing it because they want improvements in their body. So they're doing it for weight loss. So they have different needs in their energetic systems. So that means that the methods that they are applying will be different than the methods that are being used by professional athletes. So, like I said, in order to develop your energetic systems through endurance training, you have to implement the models of training zones. Next slide. So, in order to do that, history has been offering so many different models. And back in the 50s, one of the first models was from Carbone in 1957. And this is actually the first model that tried to run away from the general prescription of physical activity and say, okay, there's a possibility that by using this model, you could target a specific intensities, which should help actually to improve your endurance. So Carbone came with a heart rate reserve method, and I'm quite sure that some of you may have even heard of it because it's still in use. It's still in use, and this model says that your training heart rate will be defined by using resting heart rate and maximal heart rate. And based on that, you will get your reserve heart rate, and based on that, you will determine your zones. But however, there's a huge problem with this model, because this model is based on the resting heart rate. So what does it mean? You are all familiar that as you get better with fitness, your resting heart rate decreases. So if you use this model, as the heart rate will decrease, so will your training zones decrease. So from physiological perspective, it's useless. But back in the 50s, this was a major breakthrough. It was like, wow, for the first time, it's not one size fits all. We can actually determine specific intensities and we can train like this. But like I said, science has showed that from the aspect of physiology, this model is pretty not useless, it's useless. And however, it still exists. So when you come across such a model, be aware. Next slide, please. So as the time progressed, American College of Sports Medicine, which is a rooftop institution in the United States when it comes to sports medicine, sports science, etc., came to the idea, okay, let's develop guidelines for physical activity. So we want to reduce the mortality. Let's create the guidelines for physical activity. And they created their guidelines by using a very famous equation that I think everybody's familiar here. It's 2000 minus the age. And they say, okay, 2000 minus the age, it's your maximal heart rate. And then we will divide that into 5 subzones. And this is where you will train different aspects of your endurance. And this should help you improve your, not just physical activity, but life standard. So, however, there's a huge problem. The equation 220 minus age, even though extremely familiar, and I believe everybody has used it, it's made up equation. No scientific basis for this equation. Somebody made it up just to have so that he can use it, because it was impossible back in the days to go to the CPET labs and to do actual testing to determine maximal heart rate. So they said, okay, let's develop a model that will help us determine the maximal heart rate without going to the laboratories. And they came up with the 220 minus the age. Even though it was originally attributed to Fox and said he made it in 1971, 71, sorry, he didn't. He didn't. That's equation that they done some testing on 7 cardio patients, and they saw, okay, during the CPET testing, so spirometry physiological assessment test, the maximal heart rate is about 220 minus the age. Let's use that. Can you really use in general, when you say we have millions or even millions of people who are physically active, to say that we can use equation that we have developed using 7 cardio patients? No, we can't. So there's absolutely no scientific background for using the equation 220 minus the age. However, this flowed system became the cornerstone of exercise that, as we know it today, and it's being used for decades. Even today, you are well familiar how to determine your training zones based on maximal heart rate. And now, as you know, it's a mythical equation. It's made-up equation. Next slide, please. So, yes. Okay, so like I said, as this and the need for exercise intensity prescription became familiar, more popular, and there was a higher demand for such things, a certain figure named Sally Edwards in 1993 said, okay, this what ACM is doing, it's great. I love it. They have the model for maximal heart rate. They have the model for 5 subzones. Let's try to sell this. This could make a lot of money. And then she kind of made a deal with Polar, and you are all familiar with Polar. We're leading, beside Garmin, we're leading producer of heart rate watches. And she said, okay, let's implement this in your watches. Let's use 220 minus age. Let's divide this to fixed intensities. And let's say zone 1 is from 50 to 60% maximal heart rate. Zone 2 is from 60 to 70. Zone 3 is from 70 to 80. Zone 4 is from 80 to 90. And zone 5 is from 90 to 100% of the maximal heart rate. And this will sell because people want to have control over the exercise intensity. And she was right. All the watches adopted that model, and it made them millions. Later in the years, as already said, studies that came showed us how imprecise is 220 minus the age model. And for example, studies from Tanaka, which was 20 years ago, said that it can miss over 10 beats per minute when it comes to maximal heart rate, and it's very heart rate, and it's very dependable on the subject being tested. So it can't be the same for the athlete, for the male, from the female, from the young, for the older. They are completely different models should be applied. And the problem with this is that it presumes we are all the same. So 220 minus the age, that will mean that whoever has the same age, he will have the same training zones, which we all know it's not the case. Also, the biggest problem, not just the equation and the maximal heart rate, the problem is that this approach completely ignores the individuality of the subject, meaning that it presumes that just based on your age, we all have the same zones at the same position, but I will actually show you that it's not the case. It's not the case because, for example, you have 2 athletes that train in their theoretical zone 4, which is determined through this model, meaning from 80 to 90% of the maximal heart rate. They can be in completely different metabolic energy systems. One can be in zone 3, one can be in zone 4, or maybe even in zone 5. And I will later explain how that is possible. So from the aspect of physiology, you using the maximal heart rate model derived from the equation is absolutely wrong. Next slide. This is the example of how this model looks. And I think everybody of you has seen this table before. This is fixed determined training zones from the maximal heart rate. Sometimes this model can vary, and you will see that they're not using the maximal heart rate, but using the percentage of maximal VO2 max, maximal oxygen uptake. Why? Well, because the science has shown that there's a correlation between maximal heart rate and maximal VO2 max. So they can be used interchangeably, but it's actually the same model. They're just using the different description. And now you can see that based on this, it would seem that just age is all it needs, and we are all the same, which is actually not the case. Next slide, please. So, for athletes, they needed something more. This was not acceptable for the professional athletes. They needed something that will make sure that their performance gets better. Not just applying theory, but they need to make sure that their performance will improve, it will get them gold medals. So they are called in the science and said, okay, this general approach doesn't work for us. Science, please step in, try to resolve this problem by creating a specific models that will actually help us. Next slide, please. So, even at the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, biochemistry started to not develop, but they started to introduce us to certain energetic systems. And they have showed us that there are three energetic systems that exist. First is the aerobic energetic system, meaning that that's the system that uses oxygen to burn fat, to produce energy, to produce ATP. So then there was another system that was shown to call aerobic anaerobic system, which uses combination of presence of oxygen and non-presence of oxygen, and through either oxidation or anaerobic glycolysis to create ATP. Who knows what ATP is? Adenosine triphosphate. It's the, as written there, it's the energy currency of the body. That's what, when fat and carbohydrates are reduced to smaller units, they are actually creating ATP, and this is what moves your muscles. Plain words, this is what moves your muscles. And then we have a third system, which is actually the anaerobic system. It's the creatine phosphate and ATP. It's a fast twitching fiber system, which gives us energy extremely fast. But the problem is that it's highly dependent on the glucose. Why is that a problem? Anybody knows?
Because we don't have too much muscle.
Exactly. The problem with glucose is that it's in our glucose depots, and we are limited with the amount of glucose in our body. Praxis says that once you enter the anaerobic zone, you can't stay in the zone longer than 120 minutes. You can generate up to 2,500 kilocalories from your glucose depots. So certain athletes believe that they can compensate for that by using these carbohydrate gels. No, they can't, because our digestion system can't digest more than 40 to 50 grams per hour. If you convert that to kilocalories, you will come that it's about 250 kilocalories per hour. If you were ever tested in the CPET lab, you would see that once you enter zone 4 and 5, and I will later come to that, what that means, but in general, once you enter the anaerobic zone, only fuel source are carbohydrates, and your kilocalories expansion rises. And in average, depending on the body mass, you burn around 1,000 and up kilocalories. So imagine you are now in the sport discipline where you know that you have to be active for 3 or 4 hours. And you are in the anaerobic zone and you only burn carbs. And you burn around 1,000, 1,200. I've seen large people like myself, I burn even 1,500 once I enter in the anaerobic zone. And that's just the beginning. As I want to be faster in the anaerobic zone, it rises. That means that there are no gels in the world that can compensate for how much I'm expending. It's not possible. So that's why it's very important to have your athlete be physically active in the aerobic zone, because that's the only way to actually maintain endurance in long durations. And this is actually what the purpose or optimization of the energetic systems mean, to position your energetic systems in accordance with your need. Long endurance athletes need to position their physical activity in zone where they burn fat, and that can be done by manipulating the energy systems. So, like I said, phosphocreatine, ATP, they were discovered even back in 1927, then 1929. Then Lippmann introduced ATP, that's its main energy currency back in the 41. And then there was a team of professors, MD Meyerhoff Parnas, who mapped the glucose conversion into lactate back in the 30s. However, these were all individual researches, and then came Donald Fox, who said, okay, this is very interesting, look what they found. They found that there are different energy systems. Let me put this in the context of sports, and let me see how these systems work during the physical activity. And so then he made it publicly available in 1973 in his studies, and said, during the physical activity, these are the main free energy systems that your body uses when you are physically active, and as the intensity progresses, this is how they change. Next slide, please. So, after time, or pretty much after the Fox made his publication available, other researchers started to think, okay, we have free energy systems, but is there actually some border between those systems? Or they're just like interchangeably happening? Or is there like a specific change? When do they change from the aerobic to aerobic anaerobic? And when do they change to anaerobic? So using the gas analysis methods that were starting to be available at that time, Hollmann in 1958 came to see that there's a change, a certain threshold happening in your aerobic zone. I wouldn't call it a threshold, but threshold is very fancy term everybody is using. But he noticed that there's a peak in the fat oxidation, which actually correlates with another value of your ventilator equivalent. So this is how much oxygen you need to intake to actually burn fat. And he noticed that they're in correlation and said, okay, I would call this point of optimal ventilatory efficiency, because this is the point where you are mostly economically working. You're burning the least amount of energy needed to intake oxygen. And he called it the point of optimal ventilatory efficiency. Sometime later, a researcher from Germany, Wassermann, found the same thing, but he termed it threshold of anaerobic metabolism. And that made a problem, because he didn't actually know what he found. He did find the threshold, but he was certain that this is a transition from aerobic to anaerobic. And he said, I will name this anaerobic threshold. And the problem that we have in exercise physiology today is, and I believe everybody here will come to see that, you will find a study on the topic of thresholds, and you will see the author is using the term anaerobic threshold. And you will say, okay, this is then probably the second threshold, anaerobic threshold. But when you read deeper and you see what methods he used to identify the threshold, you will notice he's actually talking about the first threshold. So there's a confusion from misused terminology that originated back in the 70s to Wassermann. So some scientists tried to correct this, like Kinderman in 79. He said, this is actually the aerobic threshold. It's not anaerobic, it's aerobic, to improve clarity, but the false terminology still sticks. So whenever you're reading a scientific paper on the terminology or the thresholds, be sure to read the part about methodology and how the threshold is determined. Based on that, you will know what threshold is he actually talking about. And then Mader in 76, a very famous German scientist, found out that all of this, what these previous scientists are talking about, determination of ventilatory thresholds can actually be determined from lactate. So changes in the lactate curve coincided with the first threshold, and he called it the first lactate threshold. And now, in this modern era, you will come to see that this first threshold is called aerobic threshold, first ventilatory threshold, first lactate threshold, point of optimal ventilatory efficiency, even sometimes anaerobic threshold, or only ventilatory threshold. So a lot of non-standardized terminology to actually name the first threshold. Second threshold, that was actually what Wasserman thought that he has found. It's the change from aerobic, anaerobic energy systems to pure anaerobic system. That is actually the anaerobic threshold. However, science firstly found the deflection in the lactate, and it only took about 10 years later to confirm this deflection by using the gas analysis. So it was different than for the first threshold. First, the lactate curve described the existence of this, let's call it knick, and then later by team from Beaver. I think everybody here has heard maybe if they have ever done the CPET test, Beaver method for identification of the threshold. They found it in '86 that there's actually change in the ventilation, and that actually defines your jump from aerobic, anaerobic to anaerobic zone. So, due to work of Kinderman, who tried to help us by renaming the anaerobic to aerobic, the first threshold, and to avoid misinterpretation, this second threshold is now called the anaerobic threshold. However, you will read studies and you will see that they are calling it anaerobic threshold. They are calling it second ventilatory threshold, lactate turn point 2, lactate threshold, respiratory compensation point, maximum lactate steady state, maximum aerobic steady state. So many different terminology. And I know this will be probably confusing, but that's why it's very important that you are familiar with the history of the concepts so that you actually understand what are they talking about. Next slide, please. And parallel with the identification of the thresholds, science realized that if you want to improve your energetic systems, it's not about the physical activity in the energy domains, it's about physical activity that influences the thresholds. By influencing the thresholds, you can actually move the energy domains. Do you follow me what I mean by this? Mm-hmm. So you have to influence the threshold. As the threshold moves, it pulls the domain with it. It makes it bigger. And this is one of the most important findings. Even back in the 70s, they realized influence the thresholds if you want to improve your energy domains. Not training by in domains, but training on the thresholds. Next slide, please. And 1980, team of researchers by Skinner and McMillan said, okay, there are a lot of different things now available. Let us take it all into one paper and present it how different free energy domains, two thresholds, which are now like fully scattered all over the science, work in the domain of science, or in the domain of sports. And they published a revolutionary paper explaining the free energy domains and two thresholds, and said, okay, based on this, we have your training zones. You have three training zones. First domain is moderate intensity, which is below the first threshold. This is where you are exclusively aerobic. Okay, this exclusively can also be discussed. If you work long enough with energetics, you will come to see that it's not also exclusively, because it depends on diet and on your genetics and fitness level, the magnitude of lean body mass. So it can vary, but it should be mostly aerobic. Then you have second energy domain, which is between first and the second threshold, and this is your aerobic, anaerobic energy domains. It's used for lactate clearance and to reach a stable elevated state. or like as I said, this is maximal aerobic steady state or maximal lactate steady state. And then you have a third, which is severe intensity domain, which is above your anaerobic threshold. And this is where you are predominantly solely 100% reliable on carbohydrate as an energy source. Next slide. And this is how it would look. If this is your rest, you have your first phase, aerobic energetic phase. When you burn more fat than you actually burn carbohydrate, this ratio can vary, but predominantly you use fat. This is where the type 1 slow twitching fibers are active. This is to show you how variability is present and why it's not possible to use fixed intensity explanations. For example, here you can see how aerobic threshold can vary anywhere from 30 to 70% of your maximal heart rate. Not theoretical maximal heart rate, but your heart rate determined during the testing. So it can be anywhere from 90, I've even seen it on 85, to be on 85 beats per minute, all the way to 170. So this is huge variation of the location of the first threshold. After the first threshold, you are jumping into phase 2, where there's a pretty much balance, equality between burning fat and carbohydrates. And you are mixing use of slow and fast twitching fibers. This is the zone, maybe some of you have heard, metabolic flexibility. This is how well you can manage between burning fat and burning carbs. And in this zone 2, energetic zone 2, this is where the crossover point happens. Fat goes down, carbohydrate go up, they cross. And this is actually where you can train this metabolic flexibility. You can switch this crossover point a bit back to the right. When I say right, I mean upwards. Or you can even influence when it happens at lower or higher intensities. Studies have shown that this is actually done mostly through diet and through genetics and your body composition. They are not pretty much anything else. So, for example, if you want to improve your metabolic flexibility, that happens in zone 3, don't use carbs before the training. Because when you intake your carbs, you reduce the lipolysis, it goes down. And your carbohydrate expenditure goes up. So that means you are lowering your fat oxidation levels. And then you go to anaerobic threshold, the second threshold, which can vary from 65, 95, even 100% of your maximal capacity. So also extremely wide, from 130 to 190 or 200 beats per minute when looked at the heart rate. So also very, very, very high range. And then you jump into phase 3, where you are purely anaerobically producing energy, where carbohydrates are the main energy fuel, and where only type 2 fibers, fast twitching fibers, are being used. Well, this is what you can see here, as defined by Skinner and Macmillan. This is the gold standard that's currently explaining the body metabolism during physical activity. This is the Bible. If you want to understand how body works during physical activity, this is what you need to know. Next slide, please. And these are now examples from testing. The green curve is fat, and the red one is carbohydrates. You can see how, if we start in the resting, fat goes up, but it always precedes carbohydrates. In this case, there is carbohydrate present, but sometimes when you do the testing, you will see that carbohydrate is pretty much almost zero, and the fat is at 100%. This is, for example, the case where there is a significant proportion of carbohydrate present. This could probably happen if the person ingested that carbohydrate meal before the test. And then you see how the aerobic threshold happens at the peak fat oxidation. Fat oxidation goes down, they reach anaerobic threshold, and the carbohydrate continue to rise until the maximal effort. So this would be your anaerobic zone. And like I said, if you are physically active in this zone, you won't last long. So theoretically, you can last for 220 minutes. That means if your depots of glucose are fully full. So if you have done carb loading, and then you can say, okay, I can sustain up to 2 hours in that intensity. But what happens if your anaerobic threshold is so low? You start a little bit stronger, and you go in zone 5, and you think that you can go longer than 2 hours. You won't. Now you know why in athletes, in marathon, the effect of hitting the wall happens. They collapse because they waste all of their carbohydrates. And why is that important? What uses carbohydrates as an energy source in our body other than muscles? Brain. And that's why you collapse, because you have spent all the carbohydrates. This is example another person, but the same principle. Fat max happens later on the time curve, and this is the anaerobic threshold. Aerobic threshold, same principles apply. But this is how in practice, this is how fat and carbohydrate oxidation in practice looks if you were to do the CPET testing, cardiopulmonary exercise test, to evaluate your metabolic condition to see how you burn fats and carbohydrates. Next slide, please. So, the problem now came to be that we don't have labs. Back in the days, that was 50 years ago, there were not so many labs. So what to do? How can we train athletes if we don't have labs, if we can't directly identify all 3 energetic zones, 2 thresholds? What can we do? So proxy models came to be. Different coaches, different researchers started to develop models that can indirectly, in the field, predict when the first and the second threshold happens. Why? As I said, do you develop your energetic systems by training in the systems, in the domains, or at the thresholds? At the thresholds. So they started to develop models how to indirectly determine thresholds in order to improve the energetic systems. So I believe that everything started, according to history, even back in the 20s. Some German coaches tried to implement different interval methods that could potentially and indirectly hit the anaerobic threshold to get it higher at the intensity scale. And we know that Zatopek used interval training, low training, high training, low training, high training, trying to influence his anaerobic threshold and move it up. So the first kind of most famous method was a Conconi test, who proposed that there's a non-linear rise in heart rate present, and there's a deflection point in this heart rate, and it can predict the anaerobic threshold. However, science confirmed that no. Back in the days, yes, nobody could confirm it. He said this deflection point, if you every 200 meters speed up, and once you look at your heart rate monitor, once you look at your heart rate, you will see a deflection point. That's your anaerobic threshold. And that was, wow, super, yes. Unfortunately, no. So for all of you to know, Conconi test, it's a good toy, but it's not for performance optimization. So it lacks fully physiological validity, and there are several systematic reviews who confirm that no, it can't determine anaerobic threshold. So it's imprecise. Next slide, please. What happened? Industry started to develop a big threshold by performing lactate tests, and we don't need to go to the labs. We will use lactates, field lactate tests. And first approach was standardization. And they said it was actually Mader in 1976, and then his colleague Sodin in 81. They said that first threshold, second threshold equals to 2 and 4 millimoles of the lactate values. They observed that and said, we don't need to complicate. We will have first threshold at 2, second threshold at 4. And this is the model they put in the public sports science, sport coaching praxis, and it's sticked even to these days. That aerobic and anaerobic threshold happen in 2 and 4 millimoles. Peter Janssen in 87, like you could see, a lot of previous scientists didn't invent anything, but he used these 2 and 4 millimoles and implemented it fully into the performance analysis of the athletes. He said, this is great. This can help them determine their training zones, their thresholds. Like let's use 2 and 4. He popularized it, which you will come to see. It's very famous in science that you take somebody's ideas and you popularize them and they say, oh, it's his. Well, it's not. So later, much later, studies started to question the position of 2 and 4 millimoles, and there are numerous studies who confirmed that 2 and 4 millimoles do not match individual aerobic and anaerobic threshold. Highly imprecise and should not be used. However, like I said, even to this date, these fixed models are in use. And it's not just that these fixed models are in use. There are currently over 25 different models used to identify the first and second lactate threshold. 25 different models. I will show you a very interesting picture later, where you will see that when you enter your lactate values and you see the graph of these 25 models, almost none of these models overlap. So each model is showing the first and second threshold on different intensities. So as the time progresses, science is telling us that lactate is nothing more than a proxy, which actually can't be used for fine-tuning and performance optimization. In 1996, I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about Friel. He published his training Bible, cycling training Bible, which was followed by, his book was followed by my book. What came next?
Training Bible, triathlon.
Triathlon
Yeah,
training
yeah.
Bible. So
Triathlon.
two very famous books by Joe Friel that were like huge, where he said, I have a model, and I'm calling this model lactate threshold heart rate model, and I'm assuring you that my model can predict the second anaerobic threshold. World went nuts. Oh, this is great. This can be used in cycling. This can be used in triathlon. And he said that he can determine. Let's make it better.
Okay, everybody who gets to
Mention triathlon.
no prayer. Maybe people just need to slow down. After the last one.
He said that his lactate threshold heart rate model can estimate the heart rate that has incidence with the lactate threshold by using 20 minutes of maximal effort time trial. So you are doing the maximal effort time trial lasting 30 minutes, and you take the last 20 and look at the average heart rate. And this will match your heart rate according to the second threshold. And that was a huge hit. Everybody said, oh, this is great, this is now perfect. It was a major step from moving of the generic percentage heart rate max models, because the modern science hasn't still entered the sport world. And not just sport world, we are talking, when we talk about Friel, we are talking about public. We're not talking sport, elite athletes, but public. So Friel model was a huge hit. However, it only estimates for second threshold. It presumes the fixed relation between first and second threshold, so ignores individuality. When you determine your threshold, he said 10% below is zone 4, 10% below is zone 3, 10% below is zone 2, 10% below is zone 1. So it's from physiological aspect, as you could see, no. And he said that in his first book in '96, he said, and that's also something that's very still present. I've noticed that because I have a lot of athletes coming to the lab. He said that training zones are very different depending on the sport modality. And it sticks, that belief still sticks today in the sports science because he said it. Why he said it? Because in this case, if you do 30 minutes maximum effort on the cycling, and then use last 20 to determine heart rate according to the anaerobic threshold, do you think that your heart rate, your VO2 max, is the same on cycling and running? It's not. Why not?
Muscles are involved.
Yeah. Smaller muscle mass is used for cycling. That means you are generating lower heart rate, lower VO2 max. So that means if you try to use heart rate obtained from the cycling test and say, oh, my anaerobic threshold is happening at the same heart rate in cycling, it's not, because it's different models. But in his new book, he explained what he meant by that. He said, no, thresholds, the anaerobic threshold is metabologically stable. It will always happen at the same intensity, but modalities are not transferable. However, this explanation never actually reached the population, and the old beliefs from his first book remain that for cycling, running, or different sports in general, the training zones are not the same. They happen at the different intensities. So you need to be aware that that's not the truth, and this is where the problem came to be, from this statement he made in his first book, which he later explained that it's not the case, but never got so popular to be this explanation. Next slide, please. And this is what I've been talking about. Can we just move the... Zoran, vašu sliku da podignemo malo gore. Jer možemo mi ovo pomoći? I don't know if you can move the picture, but anyway, there are some 20 models on your right side. And when you do the lactate test, so you're running on a treadmill or running a bike, doesn't matter, and every 2 minutes you take the lactate, and then you put it in an Excel sheet. And look where it says that your lactate threshold is. And now the question is, where is your lactate threshold then? Which is the correct one? So I personally, I do use lactates when I do the testing, but I don't rely on them to determine the thresholds. I use gas analysis to determine the thresholds. Lactate is just an indicator of current state. So if it's low, that means that the person is still burning fat. If it starts to go up, that means he's switching to carbohydrates. And it's very interesting. In your books, you will always see something called lactate curve, and it's always perfect. Okay, so this red line, this is how you will see your lactate curve in the books. And it will sound very logical. Okay, well, very nice lactate curve, everything is great. In practice, I've done 5, maybe even 6,000 tests in my life. You know how lactate curve looks? Like this. This is how in practice lactate curve looks. Doesn't look like that. Such a lactate curve I've maybe seen 5 times in my life. And now that you see when you're using different methods where your lactate thresholds are, now you understand how lactate as a proxy to determine the first and the second threshold is very imprecise. Very imprecise. I'm talking for recreation maybe, good, okay. But for performance optimization, no. Don't rely on lactate for performance optimization. We did a study recently where we analyzed how well the lactate models correlate with fat oxidation, because in one of our earlier researches, where Professor Nikolowski was also part of the team, we confirmed that first threshold, second threshold are a match to the fat max and fat min. They are pretty much correlated. And then we did a study by using different lactate methods to determine how well can you predict fat max and fat min. And we determined that log-log method is the most precise for fat max identification, and Dmax method is most precise for the fat min method. Everything else was highly imprecise. So my advice, I know there are a lot of scientists, I know people who build amazing careers on lactate, but my praxis, as well as the science, is showing us that lactate is highly unreliable if you're aiming to improve performance. Highly unreliable. Next slide, please. So, with time, as I said, another and different methods started to appear, which had aimed to serve as a proxies, field proxies of thresholds. I presume a lot of you have heard for FTP, Functional Threshold Power Model by Alan Kogan, or Critical Power Model that was presented by Model. These all models are designed to indirectly predict your power output at the anaerobic threshold. However, fundamentally, they are the same as any previous model because they are based on indirect prediction of the anaerobic threshold. So there are now a lot of studies which are kind of becoming very interesting because you have to learn how to read between the lines. I don't know how many of you have ever heard for Andy Jones. Andy Jones is a UK physiologist. He's most known as being the exercise physiologist of Kipchoge. He helped him go into breaking 2, etc. And he's now starting to work on cycling. And he's promoting the critical power model. And he says that it's the critical power that induces the anaerobic threshold. So when the critical power happens, it's actually that the anaerobic threshold will happen. So he's changing the perspective of the viewing. It's not that critical power happens once you reach the anaerobic threshold. He said critical power induces the anaerobic threshold. So philosophy is starting to jumping into field, but from physiological perspective, functional threshold power model, critical power model, they don't represent the physiological boundary of the anaerobic threshold, and they systematically underestimate this boundary by placing your threshold coefficient, which you have determined from this indirect method, into more heavy domains. So they are moving into zone 5, fully heavy domain. And it completely ignores the first aerobic threshold. So as you can see, it's only targeting the anaerobic threshold, it ignores the first threshold. Then you have critical speed models, or velocity and the second threshold. These are models that are pendants to the first ones, but are used for running. They have the same thing. They are all designed to indirectly predict the anaerobic threshold, completely ignoring this individuality, completely ignoring the non-existing, completely accepting the non-existing relationship between first and second threshold, which doesn't exist. So extremely flawed models, but all developed with intention to jump from the laboratory testing and provide something that could be used in the field by large masses. And there's also one model. I found it very interesting. It's called the MAF model. A lot of people still train using this model. Maximal aerobic function model, developed in '86 by Mahoney. He said that he can predict when the first threshold happens. You see that everybody was trying to work on the second threshold. Why? Well, because the second threshold, it's called the performance indicator, because that's the last state of your metabolic steady state. After that, you switch fully to carbohydrates, lactate goes up the roof. That's your last steady state if you're in your lactate clearance and where you burn fat. So that's the last state that you can actually maintain for very, very, very long duration. So everybody was focusing on the anaerobic threshold. But Mahoney said, okay, let's not work on the anaerobic threshold because I think that first threshold is very important because that's where you burn mostly fat. Let's try to develop that. So he said, I will focus my attention on that and I will develop an equation. No physiological background for that equation. He said, let's use 180 minus the age. And this will match your aerobic threshold. Just another proxy based without any biochemical or physiological background. It was his observation, and his observation always comes to be when you look 10, 20, 30 subjects, and they said, okay, these are my subjects, I will keep seeing that this is aerobic threshold that could match. You have some standard deviation, and then you propose such a model. And the problem is when these models go out in the public, then you don't have any more 10 or 20 subjects, you have several millions, and then these models don't apply anymore. Next one, please. So, metrics. As you can see, models used to determine or to identify the thresholds were either power or speed or heart rate or VO2. So we call them internal and external metrics. External metrics are speed and power, and they don't provide a precise reflection of your active physiological strain. They quantify your mechanical work. On the other hand, your internal output metrics on heart rate and VO2, they actually tell us what's the strain on what stress is your body exposed to, what metabolically happens in your body. For you, it's extremely important to understand the difference between internal and external metrics. Why? And I think everybody came across that. If you identify that somebody is having first threshold at 120 beats per minute, and he wants to know what speed he had on that threshold, and in the lab, that speed was kilometers per hour. And now he said, okay, I will train my threshold by using speed and pace to develop my threshold. I will train at the threshold. Imagine this, you go out, it's 40 degrees, you didn't sleep well, you're hungry, you are dehydrated, you didn't eat well, or you ate too much last night. Do you think that you will run at 9 km/h and having the heart rate 120? No, you will not. Your heart rate will be probably 150. The same applies to cycling. If you identify your threshold and you see that matching speed of the threshold is, 300 watts, and that happens at 120, 130 beats, when you go outside, if the environment is different, you will go up to 150 beats by maintaining the same power output. That means you're not in the same zone anymore. So you think you are because you're training in the same power output, but metabolically, your body has went to another zone. And that's the most important problem with using the external metrics. They're not reliable. They're only proxies of a certain physiological events, but highly unreliable. Please make sure you have sport watches or heart rate belts and looking at the heart rate. Of course, that applies only if you know the matching heart rate to your thresholds. Next slide, please. And then now we are coming to the modern era. So as you could see, 70s, 80s, 90s, time was spent in developing of the proxies. Let's try to run from the labs. We don't need the labs. Let's develop proxies. However, starting with the 2000 millennium time, science said, okay, let's stop working on this proxies development and let's start observing how the athletes actually train based on energetic systems. And then a certain individual, maybe you have heard for him, Steven Seiler, very famous Norwegian, he said that, okay, there's something that I would like to call training intensity distribution models. And I think that they are present because I've been looking at some studies from before, and I've been looking at my subjects, and I can notice that there's a certain pattern present in how they train. And then he developed training intensity distribution, polaris, a pyramidal, and threshold. Those three models to describe how actually athletes train in accordance to the energetic systems of the body. His method says that zone 1 training is to be in the first energetic zone, below the threshold. Zone 2 training is to be between first and the second threshold. And zone 3 training is to be everything above the second threshold. And then the problem started to appear. Practitioners, coaches, athletes misunderstood this model and started to use it as a prescriptive model, which is not. Seiler said, my model is purely descriptive. I am describing how athletes are training in different stages throughout the season. In this particular case, when he published these works, he was observing how the athletes are training in the maintenance period. What does that mean? What's a maintenance period for athletes during the season?
Maintenance.
Yeah.
Season.
Does it have to be?
Depends on the program.
You can have maintenance period, for example, during the competition, because you're not working on your progression. You're not maintaining the levels that you have achieved. So Seiler observed, I said, this is a training distribution of the athletes that I'm looking during their competition period. When we started analyzing this, we noticed that Seiler used top-level Norwegian athletes. What does that mean? His athletes had first threshold at almost 60 to 70% of their maximum levels. Extremely high level athletes. So that means now you know why his pyramid polarized model says train 80-20%. That's the maintenance. They're not working on development. So misunderstanding happened, and Seiler model became extremely popular, and the sports coaches, practitioners started to use it to prescribe training, when the Seiler himself said, no, my model is purely descriptive to describe how you distribute your training within the training zones during your maintenance period. So one of the most famous models currently used is misunderstood, and it's used to prescribe training intensity instead of course, prescribe training intensity, but in adaptive periods, where your aim is to shift the zones. This model does not allow shifting of the zones. I will come to that and explain why it doesn't allow shifting of the zones. This model is extremely granular. What does that mean? It does not allow fine-tuning. Because do you remember when we started this lecture, I said science found that if you want to move the zones, you have to influence the thresholds, not train in the domains. Seiler is describing how they train in the domains, but like he said, during the maintenance period, it was misunderstood, went out, and exploded. And now everybody here knows about the 3-zone models training, and they're trying to train using the 3-zone models, not understanding that this model is not designed to induce improvements. It doesn't affect the thresholds. You can train it. Once you reach the level where you want to be, then you can switch to this model. But before that, you need something more sophisticated. So, next slide, please. Scientists said, okay, let's resolve this issue. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's resolve this issue by creating more zones. And then certain group of scientists, which is now a very, very interesting topic, said let's have 5 zones. Let's put additional 2 zones at the threshold to allow fine-tuning, to move the threshold, to allow threshold training. Then somebody said, oh, I don't like 5 zones, I prefer 6, because I think that there are certain neurological aspects of adaptation happening at the highest intensity, so I want to have 6 zones. Then somebody said, you know what, I think there are certain psychological adaptation also happening, I want to have the 7th zone. So there's not a consensus here which is the most optimal, but now we have even 7 zones models. You will see that 6 or 7 zones models are rarely used. I don't think that you will find them anywhere other than some specific books, and you will see that mostly 5 zones model is used. This model has a very, very interesting background. And this is something that we are currently working on. Currently, there are several researchers, scientists, who are very famous in the world by presenting themselves and saying it was me and my team who developed the 5-zone model. And then you have Tonneson in 2014. Then you have Allen and Kogan in 2006. Then you have even Hoffman in 2017. All said, this is my own work, and I am presenting to the world the 5 zones model. I am placing zone 2 at the threshold, zone 4 at the threshold, and this is my genuine work. All of these models are the same. And if you start exploring and start to follow the crumbs, you will notice a lot of false citations and no actual background or explanation how they came with these models. And then a very, very interesting paper saw the light by Seiler and Deacon just a few months back, where they said that it was actually Rolf Setterdal and Ørjan Madsen from the Norwegian Olympic Committee, who were coaches in the Norwegian Olympic Committee, developed the 5 zones model and placed the zones 2 and 4 on the threshold, but never actually published their work. It was a practical thing they invented and started using it on the Norwegian athletes. And then it would seem that some 10 years later, certain authors found out that there's a model in use that was never being accredited for and said, oh, okay, I will take this to me, and said, I made this model. So very, very interesting is what is happening. So next slide. And now you can see 3 zones model that's being currently very popular with Seiler, and the 5 zones model. And now you can see how the zone 1 and zone 2 and zone 3 are delineated by the thresholds. And you can see that
Everyone who has to read
and you can see now in 5 zone models where the science has placed zone 2 and zone 4, but it was not the science. It was those 2 Norwegian coaches based on practical implications, based on their observations. You can also notice that there is no distinct border between zone 1 and zone 2, neither distinct border between zone 4 and zone 5. Next slide, please. So there's a symmetry problem. You have noticed zone 2 is below the first threshold, zone 4 is above the first threshold. And yet, these both zones have the same purpose, to induce threshold adaptation. How is that possible? One, it says you need to train below the threshold to induce adaptation, shiftment of the zone. Other says train above the threshold to induce threshold adaptation. Which one is correct? So, we came to see that the Norwegian coaches never actually used physiology to back up their decision of placing zone 2 below the first threshold and zone 4 above the second threshold. It was just an observation. And it is incredible to us that even after so many years, and there are so many authors who wanted to claim the development of 5-zone models, that nobody never actually explored the biochemistry and physiology behind such an approach, this asymmetrical approach. And what Saturn and Madsen did, they used 2 and 4 millimoles for lactate, and notice that in their athletes, 2 millimole matches pre-threshold, sub-threshold intensity, where 4 millimoles matches supra-threshold intensity of the second threshold. And this is how they actually decided, let's place zone 2 here, let's place zone 2, 4 here, based on the lactate observations. No physiological background, no physiological explanation. And that model has been so accepted by the present sports science, and it's being pushed forward as a perfect model for training zones and training improvements. So like I said, to this day, no scientific consensus or explanation exists, physiological, exists for placing zones 2 below and zone 4 above the threshold, or existence of arbitrary boundaries between zone 1, zone 2, and zone 4 and zone 5. And even some papers have concluded that and said there's a need for change. Next slide, please. So, by placing the zones as they did, they're ignoring the principles of adaptive specificity. What does this principle say? This principle is very old. It is known about it even in the 80s. It says that if you want to induce the threshold adaptation, and in this case, movement of the zone, you have to train supra-threshold. You have to train and the above the threshold. Below the threshold won't induce adaptation. Even we can mention that, we wrote the first paper ever, a systematic review of the topic of the threshold training. And we found that only supra-threshold training induced threshold adaptations. So we further confirmed in practice the principles of adaptive specificity, that only supra-threshold training induces threshold adaptation of the zone. Meaning that the placement of the zone 2 where it does not provide adaptation in the terms of the threshold. It provides adaptation, different adaptation. It provides the increase in the quality of the mitochondrial work, but does not provide the increase in the quantity of mitochondria. So if you want to shift and move your threshold, you have to train supra-threshold to increase quantity, not the quality of work, but the quantity of work. And then you will move the threshold. So, what does that tell us? That this precise, currently most precise model, it's in an urgent need of reassessment. We need to reassess the current 5 zones model that is designed for fine-tuning. Next slide, please. And to provide athletes with the most precise methods of threshold training, zone training, in order to develop their endurance. So as you can see, from the early percentage of heart rate max models over lactate models to sophisticated multi-zone systems, there's a shared error present. Unprecise identification of the intensity associated with the thresholds. Furthermore, these all models are failing to observe the thresholds as a dynamic units. They're observing them as a fixed points. That means that they're overlooking them. They're like fixed point and you need to train either or both. They're not. We found out in our research that the thresholds are zones. And that's why if you want to induce their adaptation, you need to train in that specific zone, not below it. And that's why the most modern methods are still in need of change in order to produce the most important adaptive potential. So, like I said, the validity of any model we are currently talking is its possibility to actually determine the threshold. If it can't predict the threshold, it's useless. It's just a toy. And you have to understand that we discussed that pro level athletes and their training methods are not generating money. Public health and amateurs are generating money. So all of these indirect methods are very popular because they can be sold. They're being placed in the watches, in any wearable devices, and that's why they are so popular. But you need to understand where the border is. Is this just a toy that's very interesting for some recreational runner? Or can I use this in a pro level athletic performance development? So you need to understand and scale it. And that's why it's very important that you're now familiar with the history of the concept of training zones so that you can now make your own decision. Which one do you choose? Do you want to play games or do you want to really work on your performance and development? It's up to you. So, like I said, by this imprecision that's present, even the currently most modern multi-zone models are actually not so precise and they're obscuring the very physiology they're aiming to optimize. Next slide, please. Like I said, first of all, there's a need for consensus. You have seen that there are dozens of names for the first and second threshold, which kind of confuses you. You will see that there are some new ones. Glucose thresholds. I'm not familiar with the abbreviation, but it's glucose thresholds now also being used. So this will be very confusing probably to you. So we need a consensus about the names. We need a consensus about methodology, how these thresholds are going to be determined. Currently, the most precision method is the gas analysis, and there's the only field where consensus exists. For the first and second threshold, there are two maximal free methods, and they overlap. They're absolutely identical. When we do the gas analysis, we can use only one, and we know that we are at the threshold. Other models are like backup models, so I can choose whichever I want to use. So only gas analysis is currently enough precise to provide you with information where your thresholds happen and where and how you are entering into different training zones. Technology innovations. New methods are promising something interesting. Some of you have heard about NIRS. Recent data are telling us that NIRS might be precise enough to let us know when we reach first or the second threshold. And there are even some studies that are now starting to go back to heart rate analysis, and they claim that they can identify heart rate inflection point and heart rate deflection point more precisely to actually determine first and the second threshold. We'll see, the time will show. What's the end goal? Your end goal is to make physiologically valid individualized threshold detection most accessible, practical, and standardized for all athletes and coaches. Next slide, please. Coaches and athletes, please abandon all heuristic models. Forget about them. Devote your attention to lab testing, and when you via gas analysis obtain the values of your thresholds. Based on the thresholds, you have 3 energetic zones. 2 thresholds, you have 5 training zones, and you know how to improve your endurance, because endurance aims to improve energetic systems, and this is how you become more endurant, by improving your energetic systems. Make sure you establish both thresholds using the most precise methods. Anchor your zone physiologically to thresholds. Don't use any arbitrary boundaries, and make sure you reevaluate your training. What we said earlier, adaptation. Zones are not fixed, they are dynamic, which means that once you train in the adaptive zone, you will adapt. That means if you go now do the test and you get your parameters and you train for about 8 weeks, your zones will move. That means you need to be retested. Then you get your new parameters. Then you optimize your training, and then you train again for 2 months. And you keep doing so until you have reached the metabolic state which matches your needs, which matches your sports, which matches if you want to lose weight, if you want to improve your performance. For example, you don't have to train sub-threshold if you don't aim to improve your thresholds or improve your zones. We have subjects coming in, they say, I only want to lose weight. So that means he can't train sub-threshold because he doesn't want to improve the threshold. So he will train there and burn fat in zone 2. But if he wants to improve zone 2, he has to go sub-threshold above the first threshold to improve the zone. Understand the limitations of different models that we have spoken about, how these models are used in wearable devices, and how they have found their way in modern elite sports. This is unacceptable. You can't, in modern sports, professional sports, use these proxy models. They are physiologically unjustified. You have to forget about them and believe exercise physiology and biochemistry to actually determine the thresholds and the zones. Next. Yeah. Okay. So. I know that this has been a lot of information right now, and you're rather confused, probably. Like I said, first thing, if you really want to work on the adaptation of your zones, go to the lab. Go to the lab, do the test, and get your parameters. Get your thresholds, and get your 5 zones. And then train according to those parameters. The most modern model, 5-zone model, currently has a flaw. And you have seen which one is it. Asymmetrical treating of the thresholds. We are currently finalizing the paper that needs to change that. So this is like exclusive. You are now familiar with the information that the rest of the world is not. That for improvements, zone 2 can't be below, it has to be at. So this asymmetrical treatment of the zones will have to stop, and it's going to have to be symmetrical. Zone 2, zone 4 will going to have to be at the threshold, and then you train those zones to improve the thresholds, improve your energetic systems. So this is the most important thing that you need to take with you from this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Radko. I hope that you enjoyed. I hope that it is really, I don't know if it is a physiological class or the class on the History channel, because it was so many information which filled you probably and hopefully with something giving you the historical background of everything what we are talking about. Of course, that on the class, and I'm just directing right now myself to So people who were on the exercise physiology class, we didn't scratch a little bit. We scratched just a little bit of this, and we tried to explain certain concepts and fundamentals of the exercise physiology. Nevertheless, I think that you benefited from this course and from this presentation, especially because give you some historical perspective and try to understand where the things are coming from. Because many times when we are talking about the things, we consider them as, as a final solution for everything working. I would like probably some of the things look to you a little bit too complicated, but I always would like to remind you what Albert Einstein said, that we have to explain the things in a simple way, but not in too simple. Because at the end, we are not going to understand things. And I think that this kind of information, which you, I hope, will benefit from this presentation, will open